I knew I was in for trouble the day I moved into Briarwood Estates and saw the laminated HOA rules are law sign duct taped to the community bulletin board. That was 2 years ago. Since then, I've had run-ins with the Homeowner Association's self-appointed queen, Edwina Zollner, 60-something, shoulder-padded, passive-aggressive tyrant with a clipboard surgically fused to her hand. She didn't just run the HOA. She was the HOA, but the real chaos started last Wednesday. I'd just come off a 12-hour shift. My name's Irving Wallace, by the way. I fix HVAC systems for a living, and the summer heat had half the county's air units crying for mercy. I pulled into my driveway around 8:30 p.m., exhausted, and noticed an envelope taped to my windshield. Another fine. I yanked it off and read, "Violation. Unauthorized vehicle appearance truck has commercial logos. $150 fine." I stared at my old pickup with the modest Wallace Cooling Solutions logo on the door and muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." That logo had been there since before I moved in, and no one said squat. I walked to my door, envelope in hand, when I heard her voice. "Mr. Wallace, that vehicle is in direct violation of Section 9, Sub-Rule B." I turned to see Edwina marching across her lawn in orthopedic sandals, her poodle yapping in sync with her. I said, "You do realize this is the same truck I've parked here for 2 years, right? You slipped through the cracks." "I'm correcting that." I didn't respond, just walked inside, cracked a beer, and called my buddy who's a paralegal. He told me to start documenting everything, so I did. I took photos, saved every notice, installed a security camera on my porch. Good thing I did. Because 3 days later I caught her red-handed. It was about 6 a.m. on Saturday. I was up early feeding my dog when I heard a loud crack from outside. I rushed out and saw her, Edwina Zollner, standing next to my truck with a half-brick in hand, staring at the passenger side window she'd just shattered. I shouted, "What the hell are you doing?" She jumped like a guilty teenager. "This vehicle is an eyesore and violates community harmony," she barked. "You've been warned." I pointed at the camera above my door. "You just committed vandalism on video, Edwina." Her expression changed instantly. "You wouldn't dare press charges. I am the HOA." I laughed. "Exactly why I'm going to." She stormed off, muttering about community standards and ungrateful residents. I called the cops, filed a report, turned over the footage. The responding officer raised his eyebrows when he saw it. "You said she's with the HOA?" "Chairwoman," I said. "She's been harassing me for months." "Well," he said, "someone's about to learn HOA's not above the law." I filed charges that afternoon. Destruction of private property. My insurance covered the window, but they told me her insurer would be on the hook once the court ruled. And man, was that court date satisfying. The courtroom was quiet except for the echo of Edwina's kitten heels as she marched in, her lawyer trailing behind her like a man who'd already lost and knew it. She wore a navy blazer with gold buttons and held her head high, but the color in her face betrayed her nerves. I sat at the plaintiff's table, calm, focused, and backed by a printout of the security footage, 3 witness statements from my neighbors, and a copy of the community charter she'd twisted like taffy for years. The judge, a wiry man in his 60s with a dry voice and a no-nonsense gaze, called us to order. Edwina's lawyer tried to delay the hearing, claiming their office hadn't been given adequate time to review evidence. The judge leaned forward. "You've had over 2 weeks. Motion denied." "Let's proceed." Edwina kept her eyes on me the entire time, but I ignored her. The real power was in what I had on paper, not in staring contests. I presented the footage first. The judge watched, stone-faced, as Edwina hurled that brick straight through the glass. The courtroom was dead silent when it ended until the judge turned to Edwina and said, "Do you deny that this is you in the video?" "I was fulfilling my duties as an HOA official," she said, her voice wobbling at the edges. "That truck was a repeated violation of our visual harmony clause." The judge blinked slowly. "Your duties include property destruction," her lawyer jumped in. Your Honor, if I may, my client was under the impression that she had the authority to enforce community codes in extreme cases where compliance was not being met. By smashing a window, the judge asked. That's not enforcement, that's criminal mischief. And vandalism. He didn't even need to review the rest of the evidence. The ruling was swift, guilty on charges of property damage, restitution ordered, and a heavy fine on top. But that was just the judicial side. The fallout came fast. Her insurance company launched an investigation the moment the ruling hit the system. Less than 48 hours later, she received notice that her homeowner's coverage would not be renewed. Another carrier picked her up, but at triple the premium. Apparently, having a criminal conviction tied to a property-related incident flagged her as high risk. I found out about that from her next-door neighbor, Mr. Klein, who had overheard her yelling at her broker on speakerphone. He told me this while helping me install a new security light over my garage. I hadn't asked for help, he just showed up with a ladder and a drill. She's been lording over this neighborhood for 15 years, he said as he tightened a bracket. About time someone knocked her down a peg, and with actual evidence, no less. You're a legend around here now, I chuckled. Not because I wanted to be a legend, but because it felt good knowing I wasn't the only one she'd terrorized. Within the week, I started receiving notes, actual thank you cards from other residents. One from a nurse down the street, who said Edwina had fined her for keeping her recycling bins out past noon. Another from a retired mechanic who'd been told to remove his American flag because it clashed with the HOA's seasonal color scheme. What none of them knew yet, though, was that I was just getting started. See, I'd done more than press charges. I'd also filed a formal complaint with the city's Department of Neighborhood Oversight. Briarwood Estates had received a minor grant years ago to support community-led improvement initiatives. That grant came with oversight conditions Edwina had never followed. I found the paperwork in the city's public records portal, buried under meeting minutes and budget memos. That grant required a rotating board of at least 3 elected members, public budget disclosures, and open quarterly meetings. Edwina had never held an election, never posted a budget. And those meetings? They were usually just her and her dog on a lawn chair, passing resolutions by fiat. I submitted the documentation, footage, and a notarized statement from 2 former board members who said they'd been quietly removed when they questioned her authority. The city launched an audit. Meanwhile, Edwina wasn't taking her public fall from grace well. On Tuesday morning, a week after the court ruling, I found a flyer in my mailbox titled Irving Wallace, Enemy of Community Standards. It had a grainy photo of me leaving court and a list of infractions. I had supposedly committed everything from parking his truck too close to the curb to refusing to attend HOA potlucks. I brought the flyer to my lawyer. She laughed so hard she had to wipe her eyes with a napkin. "This is defamation," she said. "You want to file another suit?" I didn't, at least not yet, but I did call the postal inspector. Distributing anonymous flyers through mailboxes without postage is a federal offense. He opened an investigation. That same afternoon, a city compliance officer showed up at Edwina's house. The audit had begun. I watched from across the street as they walked her through a list of violations. She kept trying to explain, gesturing wildly at her clipboard and referring to emergency powers and community mandates. The officer didn't seem impressed. By Friday, the HOA mailbox had a notice taped to it. All association operations temporarily suspended pending city review. I didn't tape that one up. That weekend, several of us got together on Mr. Klein's porch. Families brought snacks. Someone grilled hot dogs. For the first time in years, neighbors who'd only ever exchanged nods across driveways were laughing, trading stories, and making plans. "We should hold a real election," someone said. I nodded. "And publish a real budget." Mr. Klein raised a beer. To the end of clipboard tyranny. The crowd roared in agreement, but the story wasn't over yet. because during the audit, the city discovered something else, something bigger. Edwina hadn't just been issuing fines, she'd been pocketing them. The HOA had no separate bank account. All payments, checks, electronic transfers, even cash went to a personal account under the name Briarwood Community Expenses, which turned out to be a DBA registered solely to her. The city froze the account. A week later, she was arrested, wire fraud, misappropriation of funds. Falsifying financial records, the officer who knocked on her door didn't even bother with subtlety. They let her out in handcuffs just as the mail carrier was walking up the street. Half the neighborhood watched from their porches. No one said a word. No one had to. The silence said it all. A month later, the city appointed a temporary administrator to oversee Briarwood's transition into a functioning HOA. They set up a real election ballots, candidate forums, the whole deal. I was asked to run, but I declined. I didn't want power. I just wanted peace. And now, every time I pull into my driveway, I see more than just my old truck. I see kids riding bikes, neighbors chatting over fences, and no laminated signs declaring rule by decree. Justice didn't just fix my window, it fixed the whole street. 2 weeks after Edwina Zollner's arrest, Briarwood Estates had finally started breathing again. The clipboard regime was gone, the city was overseeing the transition, and residents were beginning to realize just how deep the rot had gone. But what hadn't yet dawned on them, and what I was only starting to piece together, was that Edwina's little HOA empire wasn't just about control or personal vendettas. It was about money. A lot more of it than anyone had guessed. On a rainy Thursday morning, I got a call from a man who introduced himself as Jeffrey Randall from the state attorney's office. I was in the middle of restocking refrigerant tanks in my garage when my phone buzzed. He said he'd been assigned to a broader investigation into Edwina's financial dealings and asked if I could come down to their office. I met him the next day. His office was in a tan building that looked like it used to be a library, the kind of place with creaky floors and the smell of paper that's been resting for decades. Randall was tall, with wind-ruffled gray hair and a button-down shirt that looked like it had just come off the rack. He didn't waste time. "We've been reviewing the HOA's financial records alongside your original documentation," he said, flipping open a file. "The city audit raised red flags, but what we've found since is significantly more serious. You mentioned in your affidavit that she accepted cash payments from residents?" "Yeah," I said, "and she insisted on it for certain infractions, claimed it saved everyone processing fees." He nodded slowly and turned the file toward me. "Over the last 3 years, we believe over $70,000 in fines. Dues and compliance fees were deposited into personal accounts linked to entities she created under different names. She even opened accounts under the name of a non-existent landscaping company and billed residents for services that were never performed." I leaned back. "So she was running the HOA like a private business?" "No," he said, "she was running it like a front." Turns out, Edwina hadn't just been issuing fake fines. She'd created invoices for maintenance projects that never happened, then paid herself through dummy vendors. One of them, Green Axis Groundskeeping, was registered to a P.O. box in a neighboring town, but the EIN on the tax forms belonged to a defunct pet grooming business also tied to her. Randall continued, "We've also discovered she applied for pandemic relief funds using the HOA's name, claiming the association lost revenue due to resident hardship. She received over $15,000 in federal relief. None of it went to the community." My stomach turned. So everyone who paid their dues during that time basically funded her fraud. Exactly. That evening, I met with several neighbors at an informal meeting in my garage. Folding chairs, a whiteboard, and a pot of coffee brought it all together. This wasn't about forming another HOA. None of us wanted that for now, but we needed to organize. Not just to stay informed, but to protect ourselves. Monica, a pediatric nurse who lived 2 houses down, had something to add. She pulled out a manila folder with copies of checks she'd written to the HOA over the last year. "Look at the payee line," she said. "None of them are made out to Briarwood Estates HOA, they're all to Briarwood Community Services." "Same with mine," said Greg, a lineman who lived near the cul-de-sac. "I thought that was just the collection name." "No," Monica said, "it's another one of her shell names." I called the bank that processed the mobile deposits. They confirmed the account was registered to an individual, not a business. We passed the folder around, more checks, more evidence. We compiled everything and forwarded it to Randall's office. A week later, Edwina was arraigned again, this time on felony charges: wire fraud, mail fraud, and misuse of federal funds. The courtroom was packed with residents. Nobody spoke. Nobody protested. It was like we were all watching the final act of a play we'd been trapped in for years. The judge denied bail, citing the extent of the fraud and her clear pattern of deception. And then the headlines hit. Local news ran the story under: HOA chairwoman accused of embezzling thousands from residents. Reporters camped outside her house for days, but the blinds stayed shut. The poodle was gone. Her car disappeared overnight, probably repossessed, but something else happened that week, something I hadn't expected. I got a letter from a man named Arnold Copeland. He said he'd been Edwina's accountant for the last 5 years and had resigned 6 months ago due to ethical concerns. He'd read about the case and wanted to contribute what he knew. We met at a diner just off the interstate. He was in his 50s, wore glasses that slid down his nose, and had a nervous way of folding his napkin as he talked. "She didn't just hide money," he said. "She moved it." According to him, Edwina had transferred over $20,000 from the HOA's accounts into a separate fund she called the Community Legal Protection Reserve. She told him it was to defend the HOA against frivolous lawsuits. But nothing was ever spent from it, he said. It just sat there. Then one day it was gone, transferred out in full to another entity. "What entity?" I asked. He pulled a folder from his bag and showed me a wire transfer slip. "Briarwood Renewal Initiative," I froze. That was the name she gave the fake beautification project she used when she tried to fine residents for not planting enough approved flora. "She set up a non-profit," I said, stunned. "She set it up, funded it herself using resident money, and then used it to qualify for more grants," Copeland confirmed. "There's no record of any actual work done under that name." I brought this to Randall. He took one look and said, "This changes everything." It did. The fraud charges expanded. The IRS was brought in to investigate potential tax violations. The state began reviewing other HOAs to make sure this wasn't part of a larger pattern. Meanwhile, Briarwood itself was changing. With Edwina out, we began seeing the neighborhood for what it could be: not a gated fiefdom, but a place where people looked out for each other. Residents volunteered to repaint the community signs. Someone fixed the broken swing set in the park. Kids started playing in the street again without being told their bikes violated some imaginary code, but closure came in the form of a letter. It arrived on a Tuesday. A plain envelope with a stamped seal from the district court. Inside was a restitution notice. Every resident who had paid unlawful fees or fines would receive compensation. The funds were being pulled from liquidated assets seized from Edwina's accounts. I stood on my porch, letter in hand, as neighbors opened theirs. You could hear the disbelief across the block. Greg walked over holding his copy. "I'm getting $900 back. Never thought I'd see a dime of that again." Monica joined us. "She stole from everyone, and now we're finally getting some of it back." I nodded. "Justice doesn't erase what she did." "But it's a start." As the sun began to set, the street filled with the sound of kids laughing, sprinklers hissing, and the quiet satisfaction of a neighborhood no longer under siege. It started with a broken window. It ended with a community rebuilt. The last few weeks had shifted the entire rhythm of Briarwood Estates. The once silent sidewalks were now busy with strollers, dogs on leashes, and neighbors actually waving at each other. I spent most evenings tinkering in my garage, not because anything needed fixing, but because it was the first time in years I didn't feel like I had to look over my shoulder just to enjoy my home. Then, a white envelope arrived from the county prosecutor's office. Inside was a subpoena. Edwina Zollner's criminal trial had been scheduled. I was listed as a primary witness for the prosecution. The charges had grown since the day she shattered my truck window. Now they included multiple counts of financial fraud, wire fraud, falsified grant applications, and malicious destruction of property. And a new one, evidence tampering. Apparently, after the city began its audit, she had attempted to delete digital records from the HOA's laptop one that was supposed to be communal property, but had been sitting in her guest bedroom for over a year. The trial took place in the county courthouse, a red brick building with stone columns and a clock tower that hadn't worked since I was a kid. The courtroom wasn't crowded this time. Most of the neighborhood had already made peace with her absence, and the rest didn't want to waste another minute watching her squirm in front of a judge. I wore a clean button-down and sat behind the prosecution table, next to an assistant DA named Corinne Talbot. She was sharp-eyed and spoke with the kind of precision that made you feel like every word had a purpose. "You'll be called after we establish the chain of financial evidence," she said while flipping through her notes. "Stay exact, don't speculate. And don't let her bait you." "Not worried," I said. "She's already done all the damage she can." Corinne paused and looked at me over her glasses. "Not quite." She slid a folder toward me. Inside were photos of 3 other vehicles in the neighborhood. A plumber's van with a cracked windshield, a nurse's compact SUV with a deep key scratch running across both doors, and a small landscaping trailer with its tires slashed. All of them had received violation notices in the weeks before being vandalized. All of them belonged to residents who'd spoken out publicly against Edwina during the city audit. "She's being investigated for targeting residents she saw as threats," Corinne said. "We believe the pattern goes back years. Yours was just the first we caught on camera." I sat back, letting that sink in. "You think she was doing this the whole time?" "We think she had help," she replied. The trial began with testimony from Arnold Copeland, her former accountant. He walked the court through the shell companies, the phony invoices, and the missing grant funds. His hands trembled slightly as he explained how she'd bullied him into silence by threatening to ruin his license with fabricated ethics complaints. When he stepped down, Edwina refused to make eye contact with him. Then came Monica from down the street. She explained how her mailbox had been stuffed with warning letters after she questioned the HOA's spending at a community meeting. The vandalism to her SUV happened 3 days later. No one had seen anything, but we all knew who had motive. When I was called to the stand, I kept it simple. I described the morning she shattered my truck window. I described the months of harassment, the fine notices, the flyers. Then I pointed to the USB drive containing the footage I'd submitted to the police. Corinne played the video. There was no sound, just the image of Edwina lifting a brick and hurling it through my passenger side window. The courtroom was still. The defense attorney, a stiff man with a pinched expression, tried to cast doubt. He asked whether I had ever antagonized her, whether the truck was insured, whether I had ever responded to her notices rudely. I answered every question the same way, calmly, directly, with no exaggeration. When I stepped down, Corinne leaned over and whispered, "You just nailed the coffin shut." But it was the next witness who drove the final nail. A man in his 40s with a wireless earpiece and a city-issued badge introduced himself as a forensic IT specialist. He had recovered deleted files from the HOA's laptop after it was surrendered during the audit. Among the files was a spreadsheet labeled Priority Targets. It listed over a dozen residents by name. Notes beside each entry described their compliance history, influence level, and risk rating. Mine was marked non-compliant, visible, problematic. The courtroom went cold. The judge, a narrow-faced woman with a reputation for being tough on white-collar crime, leaned forward and asked, "Were these files created by the defendant?" The IT specialist nodded. The metadata confirms they originated from her user account, and the last edit was made 48 hours before the city audit began. The defense's only move was to claim diminished mental capacity, that Edwina had become overwhelmed by the pressures of running the HOA and hadn't been in her right mind. They tried to paint her as a lonely widow who had taken on too much responsibility, but the prosecution wasn't having it. Corrine walked up to the jury in her closing statement and said, "This wasn't about stress. This was about power." And when she felt that power slipping, she didn't ask for help, she started breaking windows. The jury took less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to serve 6 years in a state correctional facility, with parole eligibility after 3. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to every named victim and banned from holding any position of authority in a residential association ever again. Her personal assets, including her home, would be auctioned off to repay the funds she had stolen. When the verdict was read, Edwina didn't cry. She didn't apologize, she just stared ahead as if none of it had ever happened. I walked out of the courthouse into bright sunlight. Greg was waiting by the sidewalk. "She going away?" he asked. I nodded. 6 years minimum. He let out a slow breath. "Feels like the neighborhood's finally ours again." I didn't say anything. I just looked up at the courthouse, then down the street where the city had already removed the faux gold HOA sign from our entrance. For the first time in years, there were no laminated notices, no clipboard patrols, no threats tucked into mailboxes. A few weeks later, the home that had once belonged to Edwina went up for auction. A young couple with 2 kids bought it. They painted the shutters blue, replaced the overgrown hedges with sunflowers, and set out a lemonade stand on their first Saturday. I stopped by for a cup. The little girl behind the table handed it to me with both hands and said, "My dad says this neighborhood's really nice now." I smiled. He's right. As I walked back home, I passed Mr. Klein's porch where a few neighbors were gathered under string lights, passing plates and stories. No one was talking about fines or violations or what they couldn't do, they were just living. And for the first time since I'd moved in, that felt like enough.